Well, hello. Thank you for joining. I know it's last minute. This is a little different, okay? I will not be cammed up, but I want to read an account. And there is a reason why I am reading this account. For one, learning is done individually, okay? And for me, I need to read things and listen to things, write things, and it helps me to learn. And you may be that type of learner as well. So, as I am cozy and tucked into bed right now, maybe you are as well. You might you might be tucked in. Just look at it as we're hanging out, those that stay up late, okay? We'll just hang out a bit. I want to thank you for joining. Look at that, Dom, you're here. Hello, Dom. Peace, respect, health, happiness, and love to you too. Hey, Austin. Hi. Thank you for joining. Um, you said, what is this? Some conspiracy theory? You just let me know, Austin, what you think. I'm just reading an account, okay? So it's nothing that I made up. It's just something that I'm reading, okay? So, Austin, you can, hang around and decide what you think about it, okay? I don't want to tell you what to think about it. So, Tina's here. Good evening. Thank you. You're entertained already? Good. All right. Well, it's nice to know that. Catherine, hello, hanging out. Good. A long day of gardening. I love to hear that. Susan, hello. Susan, keep the door open, okay? This is a pop-up little session, okay? It's just something for people that would catch it, and even on the replay, I hope you would enjoy it as well. So thank you again for joining from Facebook, Twitch, and oh wow, look at the good brother. Ital, Iman, hello. You just downloaded the PDF, and thank you for mentioning that. I want to share, if I can, the PDF. Oh, brother, can you share the PDF? Because I wanted to drop it in. I'm sorry, I didn't drop it in the description before I went live, but I will put it in the description, this PDF. So I'm glad you brought that up. If you can please drop it in the chatmosphere for anyone who would want to read along with me, because I'm going to read this entire book to you. And I want to later meet up with you to discuss your thoughts and some things that I discovered about the writer who brought this account forward, okay? Because again, the 1800s and the early 1900s are factoring into this and history. So I want to share these things and we can figure out. I want to see if you would be on the same page with me after hearing this account, okay? So thank you, Chris, unequally Chris. Good evening, everyone. Shalom, much love. Thank you for joining. And Joseph is joining. Oh, wow, this is special Joseph in Ireland. Thank you for joining, Joseph. Okay, this is going to be a little different, okay? And let me know if anything's going on in the chatmosphere, and I'll be focused on the reading. So if anything is going on, just let me know, okay? Because it's late and everything, and it might bring out some interesting characters, okay? All right, so I'm gonna dive in because I'd like this to be mostly me reading, okay? So let me get things set up here. If you are aware of the story, let us know. If you have any thoughts about it, just drop it on in there for anybody who's new to this, because this story and account is new to me as well. I've talked to John, John and I had a conversation, and I told him I would share this book, probably like a pop-up class like tonight, okay? All right. So it is called The Smoky God. And basically, the author's name is William Emerson. Now, this is an account by a Norwegian sailor named Olaf Jansen. And this was, as the narrative goes, it was Olaf's deathbed account of his experience. So you can look at this as, I'm just reading a book. I'm not inserting any beliefs or anything like that. It would just be like me reading a book, history, whatever, mythology at this point. Okay. So I just want you to know that. Okay. So let us begin. Okay. Get all tucked in, everybody. The Smoky God by Willis George Emerson, or A Voyage to the Inner World from an account by Olaf Jansen. Now, this is part one, Arthur's foreword. I fear the seemingly incredible story which I am about to relate will be regarded as the result of a distorted intellect, superinduced possibly by the glamour of unveiling a marvelous mystery, rather than a truthful record of the unparalleled experiences related by one Olaf Jansen, whose eloquent madness so appealed to my imagination that all thought of an analytical criticism has been effectually dispelled. Marco Polo will doubtless shift uneasily in his grave at the strange story I am called upon to chronicle. A story as strange as a Munchausen tale. Munchausen tale. Okay, it is also incongruous that I, a disbeliever, should be the one to edit the story of Olaf Jansen, whose name is now for the first time given to the world, yet who must hereafter rank as one of the notables of earth. I freely confess his statements admit of no rational analysis, but have to do with the profound mystery concerning the frozen north that for centuries has claimed the attention of scientists and laymen alike. However much they are at variance with the cosmographical manuscripts of the past, these plain statements may be relied upon as a record of the things Olaf Jansen claims to have seen with his own eyes. 100 times I have asked myself whether it is possible that the world's geography is incomplete, and that the startling narrative of Olaf Jansen is predicated upon demonstrable facts. The reader may be able to answer these queries to his own satisfaction. However, far the chronicler of this narrative may be from having reached a conviction. Yet sometimes even I am at a loss to know whether I have been led away from an abstract truth by the ignis factui of a clever superstition, or whether heretofore accepted facts are, after all, founded upon falsity. It may be that the true home of Apollo was not at Delphi, but in the older earth center of which Plato speaks, where he says Apollo's real home is among the Hyboreans in a land of perpetual life, where mythology tells us two doves flying from the two opposite ends of the world met in this fair region, the home of Apollo. Indeed, according to Hecataeus, Leto, the mother of Apollo, was born on an island in the Arctic Ocean far beyond the north wind. It is not my intention to attempt a discussion of the theogony of the deities nor the cosmogony of the world. My simple duty is to enlighten the world concerning a heretofore unknown portion of the universe, as it was seen and described by the old Norseman Olaf Jansen. Interest in northern research is international. 11 nations are engaged in or have contributed to the perilous work of trying to solve Earth's one remaining cosmological mystery. There is a saying, ancient as the hills, that truth is stranger than fiction. And in a most startling manner, has this axiom been brought home to me within the last fortnight. It was just 2:00 in the morning when I was aroused from a restful sleep by the vigorous ringing of my doorbell. The untimely disturber proved to be a messenger bearing a note scrawled almost to the point of inlegibility from an old Norseman by the name of Olaf Jansen. After much deciphering, I made out the writing, which simply said, "Am ill unto death. Come." The call was imperative, and I lost no time in making ready to comply. Perhaps I may as well explain here that Olaf Jansen, a man who quite recently celebrated his 95th birthday, has for the last half dozen years been living alone in an unpretentious bungalow out Glendale way, a short distance from the business district of Los Angeles, California. It was less than 2 years ago, while out walking one afternoon, that I was attracted by Olaf Jansen's house and its home-like surroundings. Toward its owner and occupant, whom I afterward came to know as a believer in the ancient worship of Odin and Thor. There was a gentleness in his face and a kindly expression in the keenly alert gray eyes of this man, who had lived more than 80 years, and withal a sense of loneliness that appealed to my sympathy. Slightly stooped, and with his hands clasped behind him, he walked back and forth with slow and measured tread. That day when we first met, I can hardly say what peculiar motive impelled me to pause in my walk and engage him in conversation. He seemed pleased when I complimented him on the attractiveness of his bungalow, and on the well-tended vines and flowers clustering in profusion over its windows, roof, and wide piazza. I soon discovered that my new acquaintance was no ordinary person, but one profound and learned to a remarkable degree, a man who in later years of his long life had dug deeply into books and become strong in the power of meditative silence. I encouraged him to talk and soon gathered that he had resided only 6 or 7 years in Southern California, but had passed the dozen years prior in one of the Middle Eastern states. Before that, he had been a fisherman off the coast of Norway in the region of the Lofoten Islands, from whence he had made trips still farther north to Spitsbergen and even to Franz Joseph Land. When I started to make my leave, he seemed reluctant to have me go and asked me to come again. Although at the time I thought nothing of it, I remember now he had made a peculiar remark as I extended my hand in leave taking. "You will come again?" he asked. "Yes, you will come again someday. I am sure you will. And I shall show you my library and tell you many things of which you have never dreamed. Things so wonderful that it may be you will not believe me." I laughingly assured him that I would not only come again, but would be ready to believe whatever he might choose to tell me of his travels and adventures. In the days that followed, I became well acquainted with Olaf Jansen, and little by little he told me his story, so marvelous that its very daring challenges reason and belief. The old Norseman always expressed himself with so much earnestness and sincerity that I became enthralled by his strange narrations. Then came the messenger's call that night, and within the hour, I was at Olaf Jansen's bungalow. He was well impatient at the long wait, although after being summoned, I had come immediately to his bedside. "I must hasten," he exclaimed, while yet he held my hand in greeting. "I have much to tell you that you know not, and I will trust no one but you. I fully realize," he went on hurriedly, "that I shall not survive the night. The time has come to join my fathers in the great sleep." I adjusted the pillows to make him more comfortable and assured him I was glad to be able to serve him in any way possible, for I was beginning to realize the seriousness of his condition. The lateness of the hour, the stillness of the surroundings, the uncanny feeling of being alone with the dying man, together with his weird story, all combined to make my heart beat fast and loud with a feeling for which I have no name. Indeed, there were many times that night by the old Norseman's couch, and there have been many times since, when a sensation rather than a conviction took possession of my very soul, and I seemed not only to believe in, but actually see the strange lands, the strange people, and the strange world of which he told, and to hear the mighty orchestral chorus of 1,000 lusty voices. For over 2 hours, he seemed endowed with almost superhuman strength, talking rapidly and to all appearances rationally. Finally, he gave me into finally he gave me into my hands certain data, drawings, and crude maps. These, said he in conclusion, I leave in your hands. If I can have your promise to give them to the world, I shall die happy, because I desire that people may know the truth. For then all mystery concerning the frozen Northland will be explained. There is no chance of your suffering the fate I suffered. They will not put you in irons, nor confine you in a madhouse, because you are not telling your own story, but mine. And I, thanks to the gods, Odin and Thor, will be in my grave, and so beyond the reach of disbelievers who would persecute. Without a thought of the far-reaching results the promise entailed, or foreseeing the many sleepless nights which the obligation has since brought me, I gave my hand, and with a pledge to discharge faithfully his dying wish. As the sun rose over the peaks of the San Jacinto, far to the eastward, the spirit of Olaf Jansen, the navigator, the explorer, the worshiper of Odin and Thor, the man whose experiences and travels are related, are without a parallel in the world's history, passed away, and I was left alone with the dead. And now, after having paid the last sad rites to this strange man from the Lofoden Islands, and still farther northward, the courageous explorer of frozen regions, who is in his declining years, and he has passed the 80 mark, had sought an asylum of restful peace in sun-favored California. I will undertake to make public his story. But first of all, let me indulge in one or two reflections. Generation follows generation, and these traditions from the misty past are handed down from sire to son. But for some strange reason, interest in the ice-locked unknown does not abate with the receding years, either in the minds of the ignorant or the tutored. With each generation, a restless impulse stirs the hearts of men to capture the veiled citadel of the Arctic, the circle of silence, the land of glaciers, cold wastes of waters and winds that are strangely warm. Increasing interest is manifested in the mountainous icebergs, and marvelous speculations are indulged in concerning the Earth's center of gravity, the cradle of the tides, where the whales have their nurseries, where the magnetic needle goes mad, where the aurora borealis illumines the night, and where brave and courageous spirits of every generation dare to venture and explore, defying the dangers of the farthest north. One of the ablest works of recent years is Paradise Found, or The Cradle of the Human Race at the North Pole by William F. Warren. In his carefully prepared volume, Mr. Warren almost stubbed his toe against the real truth, but missed it seemingly by only a hair's breadth, if the old Norseman's revelation be true. Dr. Orville Livingston Leach, scientist, in a recent article says, the possibilities of land inside the earth were first brought to my attention when I picked up a geode on the shores of the Great Lakes. The geode is a spherical and apparently solid stone, but when broken is found to be hollow and coated with crystals. The earth is only a large form of a geode, and the law that created the geode in its hollow form undoubtedly fashioned the earth in the same way. These are his quotes. In presenting the theme of this almost incredible story as told by Olaf Jansen and supplemented by manuscript, maps, and crude drawings entrusted to me, a fitting introduction is found in the following quotation. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void. And also, God created man in his own image. Therefore, even in things material, man must be godlike, because he is in the likeness of the Father. A man builds a house for himself and family. The porches or verandas are all without and are secondary. The building is really constructed for the conveniences within. Olaf Jansen makes the startling announcement through me, a humble instrument, that in like manner God created the earth for the within. That is to say, for the lands, seas, rivers, mountains, forests, valleys, and for its other internal conveniences. While the outside surface of the earth is merely the veranda, the porch, where things grow by comparison, but sparsely, like the lichen on the mountainside, clinging determinedly for bare existence. Take an eggshell, and from each end break out a piece as large as the end of this pencil. Extract its contents, and then you will have a perfect representation of Olaf Jansen's earth. The distance from the inside surface to the outside surface, according to him, is about 300 miles. The center of gravity is not in the center of the earth, but in the center of the shell or crust. Therefore, if the thickness of the earth's crust or shell is 300 miles, the center of gravity is 150 miles below the surface. In their logbooks, Arctic explorers tell us of the dipping of the needle as the vessel sails in regions of the farthest north known. In reality, they are not at the curve or the edge of the shell, where gravity is geometrically increased. And while the electric current seemingly dashes off into space toward the phantom idea of the North Pole, yet this same electric current drops again and continues its course southward along the inside surface of the Earth's crust. In the appendix to his book, Captain Sabine gives an account of experiments to determine the acceleration of the pendulum in different latitudes. This appears to have resulted from the joint labor of Perry and Sabine. He says the accidental discovery that a pendulum, on being removed from Paris to the neighborhood of the equator, increased its time of vibration. gave the first step to our present knowledge that the polar axis of the globe is less than the equatorial, that the force of gravity at the surface of the Earth increases progressively from the equator toward the poles. According to Olaf Jansen, in the beginning, this old world of ours was created solely for the within world, where are located the four great rivers, the Euphrates, the Pison, the Gihon, and the Hiddekel. These same names of rivers, when applied to streams on the outside surface of the earth, are purely traditional from an antiquity beyond the memory of man. On the top of a high mountain near the fountainhead of these three rivers, Olaf Jansen, the Norseman, claims to have discovered the long lost Garden of Eden, the veritable navel of the earth, and to have spent over 2 years studying and reconnoitering in this marvelous within land, exuberant within stupendous plant life and abounding in giant animals, a land where the people live to be centuries old, after the order of Methuselah and other biblical characters, a region where 1/4 of the inner surface is water and 3/4 land, where there are large oceans and many rivers and lakes, where the cities are superlative in construction and magnificence, where modes of transportation are as far in advance of ours as we, with our boasted achievements, are in advance of the inhabitants of darkest Africa. The distance directly across the space from inner surface to inner surface is about 600 miles less than the recognized diameter of the Earth. In the identical center of this vast vacuum is the seat of electricity, a mammoth ball of dull red fire, not startlingly brilliant, but surrounded by a white, mild, luminous cloud, giving out uniform warmth, and held in its place in the center of this internal space by the immutable law of gravitation. This electrical cloud is known to the people within as the abode of the Smoky God. They believe it to be the throne of the Most High. Olaf Jansen reminded me of how in the old college days we were all familiar with the laboratory demonstrations of centrifugal motion, which clearly proved that if the earth were a solid, the rapidity of its revolution upon its axis would tear it into 1,000 fragments. The Old Norsemen also maintained that from the furthest points of land on the islands of Spitsbergen and Franz Joseph Land, flocks of geese may be seen annually flying still further northward, just as the sailors and explorers record in their logbooks. No scientist has yet been audacious enough to attempt to explain, even to his own satisfaction, toward what lands these winged fowls are guided by their subtle instinct. However, Olaf Jansen has given us a most reasonable explanation. The presence of the open sea in the Northland is also explained. Olaf Jansen claims that the northern aperture intake, or hole, so to speak, is about 1,400 miles across. In connection with this, Let us read what explorer Jansen writes on page 288 of his book. I have never had such a splendid sail on the north, steadily north, with a good wind, as fast as steam and sail can take us, an open sea, mile after mile, watch after watch, through these unknown regions, always clearer and clearer of ice. One might almost say, how long will this last? The eye always turns to the northward as one paces the bridge. It is gazing into the future, but there's always the same dark sky ahead, which means open sea. Again, the Norwood Review of England, in its issue of May 10th, 1884, says, we do not admit that there is ice up to the pole. Once inside the great ice barrier, a new world breaks upon the explorer. The climate is mild, like that of England, and afterward balmy as the Greek Isles. Some of the rivers within, Olaf Jansen claims, are larger than our Mississippi and Amazon rivers combined in point of volume of water carried. Indeed, their greatness is occasioned by their width and depth rather than their length. And it is at the mouths of these mighty rivers, as they flow northward and southward along the inside surface of the earth, that mammoth icebergs are found, some of them 15 and 20 miles wide and from 40 to 100 miles in length. It is not strange that there has never been an iceberg encountered, either in the Arctic or Antarctic Ocean, that is not composed of fresh water. Modern scientists claim that freezing eliminates the salt, but Olaf Jansen claims differently. Ancient Hindu, Japanese, and Chinese writings, as well as hieroglyphics of the extinct races of the North American continent, all speak of the custom of sun worshiping, and it is possible in the startling light of Olaf Jansen's revelations that the people of the inner world, lured away by glimpses of the sun as it shone upon the inner surface of the earth, either from the northern or southern opening, became dissatisfied with the Smoky god, the great pillar or mother cloud of electricity, and weary of their continuously mild and pleasant atmosphere, followed the brighter light and were finally led beyond the ice belt and scattered over the outer surface of the earth through Asia, Europe, North America, and later Africa, Australia, and South America. It is a notable fact that as we approach the equator, the stature of the human race grows less. But the Patagonians of South America are probably the only aborigines from the center of the earth who came out through the aperture, usually designated as the South Pole, and they are called the giant race. Olaf Jansen avers that in the beginning the world was created by the great architect of the universe, so that man might dwell upon its inside surface, which has ever since been the habitation of the chosen. They who were driven out of the Garden of Eden brought their traditional history with them. The history of the people living within contains a narrative suggesting the story of Noah and the ark, with which we are familiar. He sailed away, as did Columbus, from a certain port to a strange land he had heard of far to the northward, sailing with him all manner of beasts of the fields and fowl of the air, but was never heard of afterward. On the northern boundaries of Alaska, and still more frequently on the Siberian coast, are found boneyards containing tusks of ivory in quantities so great as to suggest the burying places of antiquity. From Olaf Jansen's account, they have come from the great prolific animal life that abounds in the fields and forests and on the banks of numerous rivers of the inner world. The materials were caught in the ocean currents or were carried on ice floes and have accumulated like driftwood on the Siberian coast. This has been going on for ages, and hence these mysterious boneyards. On this subject, William F. Warren, in his book already cited, pages 297 and 298, says the Arctic rocks tell of a lost Atlantis more wonderful than Plato's. The fossil ivory beds of Siberia excel everything of the kind in the world. From the days of Pliny, at least, they have constantly been undergoing exploitation, and still they are the chief headquarters of supply. The remains of mammoths are so abundant that, as Gratacap says, the northern islands of Siberia seem built up of crowded bones. Another scientific writer, speaking of the islands of New Siberia, northward of the mouth of the river Lena, uses this language. Large quantities of ivory are dug out of the ground every year. Indeed, some of the islands are believed to be nothing but an accumulation of drift timber and the bodies of mammoths and other antediluvian animals frozen together. From this, we may infer that during the years that have elapsed since the Russian conquest of Siberia, useful tusks from more than 20,000 mammoths have been collected. But now for the story of Olaf Jansen. I give it in detail, as set down by himself in manuscript, and woven into the tale, just as he placed them, are certain quotations from recent works on Arctic exploration, showing how carefully the old Norseman compared with his own experiences those of other voyagers to the frozen north. Thus wrote the disciple of Odin and Thor. This is part 2, Olaf Jansen's story. My name is Olaf Jansen. I am a Norwegian, although I was born in a little seafaring Russian town of Uleaborg on the eastern coast of the Gulf of Bothnia, the northern arm of the Baltic Sea. My parents were on a fishing cruise in the Gulf of Bothnia and put into this Russian town of Uleaborg at the time of my birth, being the 27th day of October, 1811. My father, Jens Jansen, was born at Rodwig on the Scandinavian coast near the Lofoten Islands, but after marrying, made his home at Stockholm, because my mother's people resided in that city. When 7 years old, I began going with my father on his fishing trips along the Scandinavian coast. Early in life, I displayed an aptitude for books, and at the age of 9 years old, was placed in a private school in Stockholm, remaining there until I was 14. After this, I made regular trips with my father on all his fishing voyages. My father was a man fully 6 feet 3 in height and weight over 15 stone, and typical Norseman of the most rugged sort, and capable of more endurance than any other man I have ever known. He possessed the gentleness of a woman in tender little ways, yet his determination and willpower were beyond description. His will admitted of no defeat. I was in my 19th year when we started on what proved to be our last trip as fishermen, and which resulted in the strange story that shall be given to the world, but not until I have finished my earthly pilgrimage. I dare not allow the facts as I know them to be published while I am living, for fear of further humiliation, confinement, and suffering. First of all, I was put in irons by the captain of the whaling vessel that rescued me, for no other reason than that I told the truth of the marvelous discoveries made by my father and myself. But this was far from the beginning, from being the end of my tortures. After 4 years and 8 months absence, I reached Stockholm, only to find my mother had died the previous year, and the property left by my parents in the possession of my mother's people, but it was at once made over to me. All might have been well had I erased from my memory the story of our adventure, of my father's terrible death. Finally, one day, I told the story in detail to my uncle, Gustav Osterlin, a man of considerable property, and urged him to fit out an expedition for me to make another voyage to the strange land. At first, I thought he favored my project. He seemed interested and invited me to go before certain officials and explain to them, as I had to him, the story of our travels and discoveries. Imagine my disappointment and horror when, upon the conclusion of my narrative, certain papers were signed by my uncle, and without warning, I found myself arrested and hurried away to dismal and fearful confinement in a madhouse, where I remained for 28 years. Long, tedious, frightful years of suffering. I never ceased to assert my sanity and to protest against the injustice of my confinement. Finally, on the 17th of October, 1862, I was released. My uncle was dead, and the friends of my youth were now strangers. Indeed, a man over 50 years old, whose only known record is that of a madman, has no friends. I was at a loss to know what to do for a living, but instinctively turned toward the harbor where fishing boats in great numbers were anchored. And within a week, I had shipped with a fisherman by the name of Jansen, who was starting on a long fishing cruise to the Lofoten Islands. Here, my earlier years of training proved of the very greatest advantage, especially in enabling me to make myself useful. This was but the beginning of other trips. By frugal economy, I was in a few years able to own a fishing brig of my own. For 27 years thereafter, I followed the sea as a fisherman, 5 years working for others, and the last 22 for myself. During all the years, I was a most diligent student of books, as well as a hard worker at my business. But I took great care not to mention to anyone the story concerning the discoveries made by my father and myself. Even at this late day, I would be fearful of having anyone see or know the things I am writing and the records and maps I have been keeping. When my days on earth are finished, I shall leave maps and records that will enlighten and I hope benefit mankind. The memory of my long confinement with maniacs and all the horrible anguish and sufferings are too vivid to warrant my taking further chances. In 1889, I sold out my fishing boats and found I had accumulated a fortune quite sufficient to keep me the remainder of my life. I then came to America. For a dozen years, my home was in Illinois, near Batavia, where I gathered most of the books in my present library, though I bought many choice volumes from Stockholm. Later, I came to Los Angeles, arriving here March 4th, 1901. The date I well remember, as it was President McKinley's second inauguration day. I bought this humble home and determined, here in the privacy of my own abode, sheltered by my own vine and fig tree, and with my books about me, to make maps and drawings of the new lands we had discovered, and also to write the story in detail from the time my father and I left Stockholm until the tragic event that parted us in the Antarctic Ocean. I well remember that we left Stockholm in our fishing sloop on the 3rd day of April, 1829, and sailed to the southward, leaving Gothland Island to the left and Oland Island to the right. A few days later, we succeeded in doubling Sandhomer Point and made our way through the sound which separates Denmark from the Scandinavian coast. In due time, we put in at the town of Christiansand, where we rested 2 days, and then started around the Scandinavian coast to the westward, bound for the Lofoten Islands. My father was in high spirit because of the excellent and gratifying returns he had received from our last catch by marketing at Stockholm, instead of selling at one of the seafaring towns along the Scandinavian coast. He was especially pleased with the sale of some ivory tusks that he had found on the west coast of Franz Joseph Land during one of his northern cruises the previous year. And he expressed the hope that this time we might again be fortunate enough to load our little fishing sloop with ivory instead of cod, herring, mackerel, and salmon. We put in at Hammerfest, latitude 71 degrees and 40 minutes, for a few days' rest. Here we remained 1 week, laying in an extra supply of provisions and several casks of drinking water, and then sailed toward Spitzbergen. For the first few days, we had an open sea and favoring wind, and then we encountered much ice and many icebergs. A vessel large than our little fishing sloop could not possibly have threaded its way along the labyrinth of icebergs or squeezed through the barely open channels. These monster bergs presented an endless succession of crystal palaces, of massive cathedrals and fantastic mountain ranges, grim and sentinel-like, immovable as some towering cliff of solid rock, standing silent as a sphinx, resisting the restless waves of a fretful sea. After many narrow escapes, we arrived at Spitzbergen on the 23rd of June and anchored at Dėathbėd for a short time. Where we were quite successful in our catches. We then lifted anchor and sailed through the Henlenpen Strait and coasted along the northeastland. A strong wind came up from the southwest, and my father said that we had better take advantage of it and try to reach Franz Joseph Land, where the year before he had by accident found the ivory tusks that had brought him such a good price in Stockholm. Never before or since have I seen so many seafowl. They were so numerous that they hid the rocks on the coastline and darkened the sky. For several days we sailed along the rocky coast of Franz Joseph Land. Finally, a favoring wind came up and enabled us to make the west coast. And after sailing 24 hours, we came to a beautiful inlet. One could hardly believe it was the Northland. The place was green with growing vegetation, and while the area did not comprise more than 1 or 2 acres, yet the air was warm and tranquil. It seemed to be at that point where the Gulf Stream's influence is most keenly felt. On the East Coast, there were numerous icebergs, yet here we were in open water. Far to the west of us, however, were ice packs, and still further to the westward, the ice appeared like ranges of low hills. In front of us and directly to the north lay an open sea. My father was an ardent believer in Odin and Thor, and had frequently told me they were gods who came from far beyond the north wind. There was a tradition, my father explained, that still farther northward was a land more beautiful than any mortal man had ever known, and that it was inhabited by the chosen. My youthful imagination was fired by the ardor, zeal, and religious fervor of my good father, and I exclaimed, "Why not sail to this goodly land? The sky is fair, the wind favorable, and the sea open." Even now, I can see the expression of pleasurable surprise on his countenance as he turned toward me and asked, "My son, are you willing to go with me and explore? to the far beyond where man has ever ventured? I answered affirmatively, very well. He replied, may the god Odin protect us. And quickly adjusting the sails, he glanced at our compass, turned the prow in due northerly direction through an open channel, and our voyage had begun. The sun was low in the horizon, as it was still the early summer. Indeed, we had almost 4 months of day ahead of us before the frozen night could come on again. Our little fishing sloop sprang forward as if eager as ourselves for adventure. Within 36 hours, we were out of sight of the highest point of the coastline of Franz Josef Land. We seemed to be in a strong current running north by northeast. Far to the right and to the left of us were icebergs, but our little sloop bore down on the narrows and passed through the channels and out into open seas, channels so narrow in places that our craft had been if it had been other than small, we never could have gotten through. On the third day, we came to an island. Its shores were washed by an open sea. My father, determined to land and explore for a day, this new land was destitute of timber, but we found a large accumulation of driftwood on the northern shore. Some of the trunks of the trees were 40 feet long and 2 feet in diameter. After 1 day's exploration of the coastline of this island, we lifted anchor and turned our prow to the north in an open sea. I remember that neither my father nor myself had tasted food for almost 30 hours. Perhaps this was because of the tension of excitement about our strange voyage in waters further north, my father said, than anyone had ever been before. Active mentality had dulled the demands of the physical needs. Instead of the cold being intense as we had anticipated, it was really warmer and more pleasant than it had been in the Hammerfest on the north coast of Norway some 6 weeks before. We both frankly admitted that we were very hungry, and forthwith I prepared a substantial meal from our well-stored larder. When we had partaken heartily of the repast, I told my father I believed I would sleep, as I was beginning to feel quite drowsy. Very well, he replied, I will keep the watch. I have no way to determine how long I slept. I only know that I was rudely awakened by a terrible commotion of the sloop. To my surprise, I found my father sleeping soundly. I cried out lustily to him and started up. He sprang quickly to his feet. Indeed, had he not instantly clutched the rail, he would certainly have been thrown into the seething waves. A fierce snowstorm was raging. The wind was directly astern, driving our sloop at a terrific speed, and was threatening every moment to capsize us. There was no time to lose. The sails had to be lowered immediately. Our boat was writhing in convulsions. A few icebergs we knew were on either side of us, but fortunately the channel was open directly to the north. But would it remain so? In front of us, girding the horizon from left to right, was a vaporish fog or mist, black as Egyptian night at the water's edge, and white like a steam cloud toward the top, which was finally lost to view as it blended with the great white flakes of falling snow. Whether it covered a treacherous iceberg or some other hidden obstacle against which our little sloop would dash and send us to a watery grave, or was merely the phenomenon of an Arctic fog, there was no way to determine. By what miracle we escaped being dashed to utter destruction, I do not know. I remember our little craft creaked and groaned as if its joints were breaking. It rocked and staggered to and fro as it clutched by some fierce undertow of whirlpool or maelstrom. Fortunately, our compass had been fastened with long screws to a crossbeam. Most of our provisions, however, were tumbled out and swept away from the deck of the cuddy. And had we not taken the precaution at the very beginning to tie ourselves firmly to the mast of the sloop, we should have been swept into the lashing sea. Above the deafening tumult of raging waves, I heard my father's voice. "Be courageous, my son," he shouted. "Odin is the god of the waters and the companion of the brave, and he is with us. Fear not." To me, it seemed there was no possibility of our escaping a horrible death. The little sloop was shipping water. The snow was falling so fast as to be blinding, and the waves were tumbling over our counters in reckless white spray fury. There was no telling what instant we should be dashed against some drifting ice pack. The tremendous swells would heave us up to the very peaks of mountainous waves, then plunge us down into the depths of the sea's trough, as if our fishing sloop were a fragile shell. Gigantic white-capped waves were veritable walls, fenced us in fore and aft. This terrible, nerve-wracking ordeal, with its nameless horrors of suspense and agony of fear, indescribable, continued for more than 3 hours. And all the time we were being driven forward at fierce speed. Then suddenly, as if growing weary of its frantic exertions, the wind began to lessen its fury and by degrees to die down. At last, we were in perfect calm. The fog mist had also disappeared, and before us lay an iceless channel, perhaps 10 or 15 miles wide, with a few icebergs far away to our right, and an intermittent archipelago of smaller ones to the left. I watched my father closely, determined to remain silent until he spoke. Presently, he untied the rope from his waist and, without saying a word, began working the pumps, which fortunately were not damaged, relieving the sloop of the water it had shipped in the madness of the storm. He put up the sloop sails as calmly as if casting a fishing net, and then remarked that we were ready for a favoring wind when it came. His courage and persistence were truly remarkable. On investigation, we found less than 1/3 of our provisions remaining. While to our utter dismay, we discovered that our water casks had been swept overboard during the violent plungings of our boat. 2 of our water casks were in the main hold. Both were empty. We had a fair supply of food, but no fresh water. I realized at once the awfulness of our position. Presently, I was seized with a consuming thirst. "It is indeed bad," I remarked my father. "However, let us dry our bedraggled clothing, for we are soaked to the skin. Trust to the god Odin, my son. Do not give up hope." The sun was beating down slantedly as if we were in a southern latitude instead of in the far northland. It was swinging around, its orbit ever visible and rising higher and higher each day, frequently mist-covered, yet always peering through the laced work of clouds like some fretful eye of fate, guarding the mysterious northland and jealously watching the pranks of men. Far to our right, the raised decking of prisms of icebergs were gorgeous. Their reflections emitted flashes of garnet, of diamond, of sapphire, a pyrotechnic panorama of countless colors and shapes, while below could be seen the green-tinted sea and above the purple sky. I tried to forget my thirst by busying myself with bringing up some food and an empty vessel from the hold. Reaching over the side rail, I filled the vessel with water for the purpose of laving my hands and face. To my astonishment, when the water came in contact with my lips, I could taste no salt. I was startled by the discovery. "Father," I fairly grasped, the water, it is fresh." "What, Olaf?" exclaimed my father, glancing hastily around. "Surely you are mistaken. There is no land. You are going mad." "But taste it," I cried. And thus we made the discovery that the water was indeed fresh. Absolutely so, without the least briny taste or even the suspicion of a salty flavor. We forthwith filled our 2 remaining water casks, and my father declared it was a heavenly dispensation of mercy from the gods Odin and Thor. We were almost beside ourselves with joy, but hunger bade us end our enforced fast. Now that we had found fresh water in the open sea, what might we not expect in this strange latitude where ship had never before sailed and the splash of an oar had never been heard? We had scarcely appeased our hunger when a breeze began filling the idle sails, and glancing at the compass, we found the northern point pressing hard against the glass. In response to my surprise, my father said, I have heard of this before. It is what they call the dipping of the needle. We loosened the compass and turned it at right angles with the surface of the sea before its point would free itself from the glass and point according to unmolested attraction. It shifted uneasily and seemed as unsteady as a drunken man, but finally pointed a course. Before this, we thought the wind was carrying us north by northwest, but with the needle free, we discovered, if it could be relied upon, that we were sailing slightly north by northeast. Our course, however, was ever trending northward. This sea was serenely smooth, with hardly a choppy wave, and the wind brisk and exhilarating. The sun's rays were striking us aslant, furnished tranquil warmth. And thus time wore on day after day, and we found from the record in our logbook, we had been sailing 11 days since the storm in the open sea. By strictest economy, our food was holding out fairly well, but beginning to run low. In the meantime, one of our casks of water had been exhausted, and my father said, "We will fill it again." But to our dismay, we found the water was now as salt as in the region of the Lofoten Islands off the coast of Norway. This necessitated our being extremely careful of the remaining cask. I found myself wanting to sleep much of the time. Whether it was the effect of the exciting experience of sailing in unknown waters or the relaxation from the awful excitement incident to our adventure in a storm at sea, or due to want of food, I could not say. I frequently lay down on the bunker of our little sloop and looked far up into blue dome of the sky, and notwithstanding the sun was shining far away in the east, I always saw a single star overhead. For several days, when I looked for this star, it was always there directly above us. It was now, according to our reckoning, about the 1st of August. The sun was high in the heavens and was so bright that I could no longer see the one lone star that attracted my attention a few days earlier. One day, about this time, my father startled me by calling my attention to a novel sight far in front of us, almost at the horizon. "It is a mock sun," exclaimed my father. "I have read of them. It is called a reflection or mirage. It will soon pass away." But this dull red false sun, as we supposed it to be, did not pass away for several hours. And while we were unconscious of its emitting any rays of light, still there was no time, therefore, when we could not sweep the horizon in front and locate the illumination of the so-called false sun during a period of at least 12 hours out of every 24 hours. Clouds and mist would at times almost but never entirely hide its location. Gradually, it seemed to climb higher in the horizon of the uncertain purple sky as we advanced. It could hardly be said to resemble the sun except in its circular shape, and when not obscured by clouds or the ocean mist, it had been a hazy red, bronzed in appearance, which would change to a white like luminous cloud, as if reflecting some greater light beyond. We finally agreed in our discussion of this smoky, furnace-colored sun that whatever the cause of the phenomenon, it was not a reflection of our sun, but a planet of some sort, a reality. One day, soon after this, I felt exceedingly drowsy and fell into a sound sleep. But it seemed that I was almost immediately aroused by my father's vigorous shaking of me by the shoulder and saying, "Olaf, awaken. There is land in sight." I sprang to my feet, and oh, joy unspeakable. There, far in the distance, yet directly in our path, were lands just boldly into the sea. The shoreline stretched far away to the right of us, as far as the eye could see, and all along the sandy beach were waves breaking into choppy foam, receding, then going forward again, ever chanting in monotonous, thunderous tones the song of the deep. The banks were covered with trees and vegetation. I cannot express my feeling of exultation at this discovery. My father stood motionless, his hand on the tiller, looking straight ahead, pouring out his heart in thankful prayer and thanksgiving to the gods Odin and Thor. In the meantime, a net which we found in the stowage had been cast, and we caught a few fish that materially added to our dwindling stock of provisions. The compass, which we had fastened back in its place in fear of another storm, was still pointing due north and moving on its pivot, just as it had in Stockholm. The dipping of the needle had ceased. What could this mean? Then, too, our many days of sailing had certainly carried us far past the North Pole, and yet the needle continued to point north. We were sorely perplexed, for surely our direction was now south. We sailed for 3 days along the shoreline, then came to the mouth of the forge or river of immense size. It seemed more like a great bay, and into this we turned our fishing craft, the direction being slightly northeast of south. By the assistance of a fretful wind that came to our aid about 12 hours out of every 24, we continued to make our way inland into what afterward proved to be a mighty river, and which we learned was called by the inhabitants Heidekel. We continued our journey for 10 days thereafter and found we had fortunately attained a distance inland where ocean tides no longer affected the water, which had become fresh. The discovery came none too soon, for our remaining cask of water was well nigh exhausted. We lost no time in replenishing our cask and continued to sail further up the river when the wind was favorable. Along the banks, great forests, miles in extent, could be seen stretching away on the shoreline. The trees were of enormous size. We landed after anchoring near a sandy beach and waded ashore, and were rewarded by finding a quantity of nuts that were very palatable and satisfying to our hunger, and a welcome change from the monotony of our stock of provisions. It was about the 1st of September, over 5 months, we calculated, since our leave taking from Stockholm. Suddenly, we were frightened almost out of our wits by hearing in the far distance the singing of people. Very soon thereafter, we discovered a huge ship gliding down the river directly toward us. Those aboard were singing in one mighty chorus that, echoing from bank to bank, sounded like 1,000 voices, filling the whole universe with quivering melody. The accompaniment was played on stringed instruments, not unlike our harps. It was a larger ship than any we had ever seen and was differently constructed. At this particular time, our sloop was becalmed and not far from the shore. The bank of the river, covered with mammoth trees, rose up several hundred feet in beautiful fashion. We seemed to be on the edge of some primeval forest that doubtless stretched far inland. The immense craft paused, and almost immediately a boat was lowered, and 6 men of gigantic stature rowed to our little fishing sloop. They spoke to us in a strange language. We knew from their manner, however, that they were not unfriendly. They talked a great deal among themselves, and one of them laughed immoderately, as though in finding us a queer discovery had been made. One of them spied our compass, and it seemed to interest them more than any other part of our sloop. Finally, the leader motioned as if to ask whether we were willing to leave our craft to go on board their ship. "What say you, my son?" asked my father. "They cannot do any more than kill us." "They seem to be kindly disposed," I replied, "although what terrible giants! They must be the select 6 of the kingdom's crack regiment. Just look at their great size. We may as well go willingly as be taken by force," said my father, smiling, "for they are certainly able to capture us." Thereupon he made known by signs that we were ready to accompany them. Within a few minutes, we were on board the ship, and half an hour later, our little fishing craft had been lifted bodily out of the water by a strange sort of hook and tackle and set on board as a curiosity. There were several hundred people on board this, to us, mammoth ship, which we discovered was called the Naz, meaning, as we afterward learned, pleasure, or to give a more proper interpretation, pleasure excursion ship. If my father and I were curiously observed by the ship's occupants, this strange race of giants offered us an equal amount of wonderment. There was not a single man aboard who would not have measured fully 12 feet in height. They all wore full beards, not particularly long, but seemingly short cropped. They had mild and beautiful faces, exceedingly fair, with ruddy complexions. Their hair and beard of some were black, others sandy, and still others yellow. The captain, as we designated the dignitary in command of the great vessel, was fully a head taller than any of his companions. The women averaged from 10 to 11 feet in height. Their features were especially regular and refined, while their complexion was of a most delicate tint, heightened by a healthful glow. Both men and women seemed to possess that particular case of manner which we deemed a sign of good breeding, and notwithstanding their huge statures, there was nothing about them suggesting awkwardness. As I was a lad in only my 19th year, I was doubtless looked upon as a true Tom Thumb. My father, 6'3", did not lift the top of his head above the waist of these people. Each one seemed to vie with the others in extending courtesies and showing kindness to us. But all laughed heartily, I remembered, when they had to improvise chairs for my father and myself to sit at table. They were richly attired in a costume particular to themselves and very attractive. The men were clothed in handsomely embroidered tunics of silk and satin and belted at the waist. They wore knee breeches and stockings of fine textures, while their feet were encased in sandals adorned with gold buckles. We early discovered that gold was one of the most common metals known, and that it was used extensively in decoration. Strange as it may seem, neither my father nor myself felt the least bit of solicitude for our safety. We have come into our own, my father said to me. This is the fulfillment of the tradition told me by my father and my father's father, and still back for many generations of our race. This is, absurdly, the land beyond the north wind. We seemed to make such an impression on the party that they were given specially into the charge of one of the men, Jules Galdea, and his wife, for the purpose of being educated in their language, and we, on our part, were just as eager to learn as they were to instruct. At the captain's command, the vessel was swung cleverly about, and we began retracing its course up the river. The machinery, while noiseless, was very powerful. The banks and trees on either side seemed to rush by. The ship's speed at times surpassed that of any railroad train on which I had ever ridden, even here in America. It was wonderful. In the meantime, we had lost sight of the sun's rays, but we found a radiance within emanating from the dull red sun, which had already attracted our attention, now giving out a white light seemingly from a cloud bank far away in front of us. It dispensed a greater light, I should say, than 2 full moons on the clearest night. In 12 hours, this cloud of whiteness would pass out of sight if it eclipsed, and the 12 hours following corresponded with our night. We early learned that these strange people were worshippers of this great cloud of night. It was the Smoky god of the inner world. The ship was equipped with a mode of illumination which I now presume was electricity. But neither my father nor myself were sufficiently skilled in mechanics to understand whence the power to operate the ship, or to maintain the soft, beautiful lights that answered the same purpose of our present methods of lighting the streets of our cities, our houses, and places of business. It must be remembered the time of which I write this was the autumn of 1829, and we of the outside surface of the earth knew nothing then, so to speak, of electricity. The electrically surcharged condition of the air was a constant vitalizer. I never felt better in my life than during the 2 years my father and I sojourned in the inside of the earth. To resume my narrative of events, the ship on which we were sailing came to a stop 2 days after we had been taken on board. My father said, as nearly as he could judge, we were directly under Stockholm or London. The city we had reached was called Jehu, signifying a seaport town. The houses were large and beautifully constructed and quite uniform in appearance, yet without sameness. The principal occupation of the people appeared to be agriculture. The hillsides were covered with vineyards, while the valleys were devoted to the growing of grain. I never saw such a display of gold. It was everywhere. The door castings were inlaid, and the tables were veneered with sheetings of gold. Domes of the public buildings were of gold. It was used most generously in the finishings of the great temples of music. Vegetation grew in lavish exuberance, and fruit of all kinds possessed the most delicate flavor. Clusters of grapes, 4 and 5 feet in length, each grape as large as an orange, and apples larger than a man's head, typified the wonderful growth of all things on the inside of the earth. The great redwood trees of California would be considered mere underbrush compared with the giant forest trees extending for miles and miles in all directions. In many directions along the foothills of the mountains, vast herds of cattle were seen during the last day of our travel on the river. We heard much of the city called Eden. We heard much of a city called Eden, but were kept at Jehu for an entire year. By the end of that time, we had learned to speak fairly well the language of this strange race of people. Our instructors, Jewel Galdia and his wife, exhibited a patience that was truly commendable. One day, an envoy from the ruler at Eden came to see us, and for 2 whole days, my father and myself were put through a series of surprising questions. They wished to know from whence we came, what sort of people dwelt without, what God we worshipped, our religious beliefs, the mode of living in our strange land, and 1,000 other things. The compass which we had brought with us attracted special attention. My father and I commented between ourselves on the fact that our compass still pointed north, although we now know that we had sailed over the curve or edge of the Earth's aperture and were far along southward on the inside surface of the Earth's crust, which, according to my father's estimate and my own, is about 300 miles in thickness from the inside to the outside surface. Relatively speaking, It is no thicker than an eggshell, so that there is almost as much surface on the inside as on the outside of the earth. The great luminous cloud or ball of dull red fire, fiery red in the mornings and evenings and during the day, giving off a beautiful white light. The smoky god is seemingly suspended in the center of the great vacuum within the earth and held to its place by the immutable law of gravitation or a repellent atmospheric force, as the case may be. I refer to the known power that draws or repels with equal force in all directions. The base of this electrical cloud or central luminary, the seat of the gods, is dark and non-transparent, save for innumerable small openings, seemingly in the bottom of the great support or altar of the deity upon which the smoky god rests. And the lights shining through these many openings twinkle at night in all their splendor and seem to be stars, as natural as the stars we saw shining when in our home at Stockholm, excepting that they appear larger. The smoky god, therefore, with each daily revolution of the earth, appears to come up in the east and go down in the west, and the same as does our sun on the external surface. In reality, the people within believe that the smoky god is the throne of their Jehovah and is stationary. The effect of night and day is therefore produced by Earth's daily rotation. I have since discovered that the language of the people of the inner earth is much like the Sanskrit. After we had given an account of ourselves to the emissaries from the central seat of government of the inner continent, and my father had, in his crude way, drawn maps at their request of the outside surface of the earth, showing the divisions of land and water and giving the name of each of the continents, large islands, and the oceans. We were taken overland to the city of Eden in a conveyance different from anything we have in Europe or America. This vehicle was doubtless some electrical contrivance. It was noiseless and ran on a single iron rail in perfect balance. The trip was made at a high rate of speed. We were carried up hills and down dales, across valleys, and again along the sides of steep mountains without any apparent attempt having been made to level the earth as we do for railroad tracks. The car seats were huge, yet comfortable affairs, and very high above the floor of the car. On the top of each car were high geared flywheels lying on their sides, which were so automatically adjusted that at the speed of the car, as the speed of the car increased, the high speed of these flying wheels geometrically increased. Jules Gaudia explained to us that these revolving fan-like wheels on top of the cars destroyed atmospheric pressure, or what is generally understood by the term gravitation. And with this force thus destroyed or rendered nugatory, the car is as safe from falling to one side or to other from the single rail track as if it were in a vacuum. the flywheels in their rapid revolutions destroying effectually the so-called power of gravitation, or the force of atmospheric pressure, or whatever potent influence it may be that causes all unsupported things to fall downward to the earth's surface or to the nearest point of resistance. The surprise of my father and myself was indescribable when, amid the regal magnificence of a spacious hall, we were finally brought before the great high priest, ruled over all the land. He was richly robed and much taller than those about him, and could not have been less than 14 or 15 feet in height. The immense room in which we were received seemed finished in solid slabs of gold, thickly studded with jewels of amazing brilliancy. The city of Eden is located in what seems to be a beautiful valley, yet in fact, it is on the loftiest mountain plateau of the inner continent, several thousand feet higher than any portion of the surrounding country. It is the most beautiful place I have ever beheld in all of my travels. In this elevated garden, all manner of fruits, vines, shrubs, trees, and flowers grow in riotous profusion. In this garden, 4 rivers have their source in a mighty artesian fountain. They divide and flow in 4 directions. This place is called by inhabitants the navel of the earth, or the beginning, the cradle of the human race. The names of the rivers are the Euphrates, the Pison, the Gihon, and the Hiddekel. The unexpected awaited us in this place of beauty. In finding of our little fishing craft, it had been brought before the high priest in perfect shape, just as it had been taken from the waters that day when it was loaded on board the ship by the people who discovered us on the river more than a year before. We were given an audience of over 2 hours with this great dignitary, who seemed kindly disposed and considerate. He showed himself eagerly interested, asking us numerous questions, and invariably regarding things about which his emissaries had failed to inquire. At the conclusion of the interview, he inquired our pleasure, asking us whether we wished to remain in his country or if we preferred to return to the outer world, providing it were possible to make a successful return trip across the frozen belt barriers that encircle both the northern and southern openings of the earth. My father replied, "It would please me and my son to visit your country and see your people, your colleges and palaces of music and art, your great fields, your wonderful forests of timber, and after we have had this pleasurable privilege, we should like to try to return to our home on the outside surface of the earth. This son is my only child, and my good wife will be weary awaiting our return. I fear you can never return," replied the chief high priest, "because the way is a most hazardous one. However, you shall visit the different countries with Jules Galdea as your escort, and be accorded every courtesy and kindness. Whenever you are ready to attempt a return voyage, I assure you that your boat, which is here on exhibition, shall be put in the waters of the river Hiddekel at its mouth, and we will bid you Jehovah's speed. Thus terminated our only interview with the high priest or ruler of the continent. We learned that the males do not marry before they are from 75 to 100 years old, and that the age at which women enter wedlock is only a little less, and that both men and women frequently live to be from 6 to 800 years old, and some instances much older. During the following year, we visited many villages and towns, prominent among them being the cities of Negai, Delphi, Hectia, and my father was called upon no less than a half dozen times to go over the maps which had been made from the rough sketches he had originally given of the divisions of land and water on the outside surface of the earth. I remember hearing my father remark that the giant race of people in the land of the Smoky God had almost as accurate an idea of the geography of the outside surface of the earth as had the average college professor in Stockholm. In our travels, we came to a forest of gigantic trees near the city of Delphi. Had the Bible said there were trees towering over 300 feet in height and more than 30 feet in diameter growing in the Garden of Eden, the Ingersolls, the Tom Paines, and Voltaire's would doubtless had pronounced the statement a myth. Yet this is the description of California Sequoia giantea. But these California giants pale into insignificance when compared to the forest Goliaths found in the within continent, where abound mighty trees from 800 to 1,000 feet in height and from 100 to 120 feet in diameter, countless in numbers, and forming forests extending hundreds of miles beyond the sea. The people are exceedingly musical and learned to a remarkable degree in their arts and sciences, especially geometry and astronomy. Their cities are equipped with vast palaces of music, were not infrequently as many as 25,000 lusty voices of this giant race swell forth in mighty choruses of the most sublime symphonies. The children are not supposed to attend institutions of learning before they are 20 years old. Then their school life begins and continues for 30 years, 10 of which are uniformly devoted by both sexes to the study of music. Their principal vocations are architecture, agriculture, horticulture, the raising of vast herds of cattle, and the building of conveyances particular to that country for travel on the land and water. By some device which I cannot explain, they hold communion with one another between the most distant parts of their country on air currents. All buildings are erected with special regard to strength, durability, beauty, and symmetry, and with a style of architecture vastly more attractive to the eye than any I had ever observed elsewhere. About 3/4 of the inner surface of the earth is land, and about 1/4 water. There are numerous rivers of tremendous size, some flowing in a northerly direction and others southerly. Some of these rivers are 30 miles in width, and it is out of these vast waterways at the extreme northern and southern parts of the inside surface of the earth, in regions where low temperatures are experienced, that freshwater icebergs are formed. They are then pushed out to the sea like huge tongues of ice by the abnormal freshets of turbulent waters that twice every year sweep everything before them. We saw innumerable specimens of bird life, no larger than those encountered in the forests of Europe or America. It is well known that during the last few years, whole species of birds have quit the earth. A writer in a recent article on this subject says, "Is it not possible that these disappearing bird species quit their habitation without and find an asylum in the within world? Whether island, among the mountains, or along the seashore, we found bird life prolific. When they spread their great wings, some of the birds appear to measure 30 feet from tip to tip. They are of great variety and many colors. We were permitted to climb up on the edge of a rock and examine a nest of eggs. There were 5 in the nest, each of which was at least 2 feet in length and 15 inches in diameter. After we had been in the city of Hectea for a week, Professor Galdea took us to an inlet where we saw thousands of tortoises along the sandy shore. I hesitate to state the size of these great creatures. They were from 20 to 30 feet in length, from 15 to 20 feet in width, and fully 7 feet in height. When one of them projected its head, it had the appearance of some hideous sea monster. The strange conditions within were favorable not only for vast meadows of luxuriant grasses, forest of giant trees, and all manner of vegetable life, but wonderful animal life as well. One day we saw a great herd of elephants. There must have been 500 of these thunder-throated monsters with their restlessly waving trunks. They were tearing huge boughs from the trees and trampling smaller growth into dust like so much hazel brush. They would average over 100 feet in length and from 75 to 85 in height. It seemed, as I gazed upon this wondrous herd of giant elephants, that I was again living in the public library at Stockholm, where I had spent much time studying the wonders of the Miocene age. I was filled with mute astonishment, and my father was speechless in awe. He held my arm with a protecting grip, as if fearful harm would overtake us. We were 2 atoms in this great forest, and fortunately unobserved by the vast herd of elephants as they drifted on and away, following a leader as does a herd of sheep. They browsed from growing herbage which they encountered as they traveled, and now and again shook the firmament with their deep bellowing. There is a hazy mist that goes up from the land each evening, and it invariably rains once every 24 hours. This great moisture and invigorating electrical light and warmth account perhaps for the luxuriant vegetation, while the highly charged electrical air and the evenness of climatic conditions may have much to do with giant growth and longevity of all animal life. In places, the level valleys stretched away for many miles in every direction. The Smoky God, in its clear white light, looked calmly down. There was an intoxication in the electrically surcharged air that fanned the cheek as softly as a vanishing whisper. Nature chanted a lullaby in the faint murmur of winds whose breath was sweet with the fragrance of bud and blossom. After having spent considerably more than a year in visiting several of the many cities of the within world, and a great deal of intervening country, and more than 2 years had passed from the time we had been picked up by the great excursion ship on the river, we decided to cast our fortunes once more upon the sea and endeavor to regain the outside surface of the earth. We made known our wishes, and they were reluctantly but promptly followed. Our host gave my father, at his request, various maps showing the entire inside surface of the earth, its cities, oceans, seas, rivers, gulfs, and bays. They also generously offered to give us all the bags of gold nuggets, some of them as large as a goose egg, that we were willing to attempt to take with us in our little fishing boat. In due time, we returned to Jehu, at which place we spent 1 month in fixing up and overhauling our little fishing sloop. After all was in readiness, the same ship, Nas, that originally discovered us, took us on board and sailed to the mouth of the river Hiddekel. After our giant brothers had launched our little craft for us, they were most cordially regretful at parting, and evinced much solicitude for our safety. My father swore by the gods Odin and Thor that he would surely return again within a year or two and pay them another visit. And thus we bade them adieu. We made ready and hoisted our sail, but there was little breeze. We were becalmed within an hour after our giant friends had left us and started on their return trip. The winds were constantly blowing south, that is. They were blowing from northern opening of the earth toward that which we knew to be south, but which, according to our compass's pointing finger, was directly north. For 3 days we tried to sail and to beat against the wind, but to no avail. Whereupon my father said, "My son, to return by the same route as we came is impossible at this time of year." I wondered why we did not think of this before. We had been here almost 2.5 years. Therefore, this is the season when the sun is beginning to shine at the southern opening of the earth. The cold, long night is on the Spitzenberg country. What shall we do? I inquired. There is only one thing we can do, my father replied, and that is to go south. Accordingly, he turned the craft about, gave it full reef, and started by the compass north, but in fact directly south. The wind was strong, and we seemed to have struck a current that was running with remarkable swiftness in the same direction. In just 40 days, we arrived at Delphi, a city we had visited in company with our guides, Jules Gaudia and his wife, near the mouth of the Gihon River. Here we stopped for 2 days and were most hospitably entertained by the same people who had welcomed us on our former visit. We laid in some additional provisions and again set sail, following the needle due north. On our outward trip, we came through a narrow channel which appeared to be a separating body of water between two considerable bodies of land. There was a beautiful beach to our right, and we decided to connoitre, casting anchor and wading ashore to rest upon for a day before continuing the outward hazardous undertaking. We built a fire and threw on some sticks of dry driftwood. While my father was walking along the shore, I prepared a tempting repast from supplies we were provided. There was a mild, luminous light, which my father said resulted from the sun shining in the south aperture of the earth. That night we slept soundly and awakened the next morning as refreshed as if we had been in our own beds at Stockholm. After breakfast, we started out on an inland tour of discovery, but had not gone far when we sighted some birds which we recognized at once as belonging to the penguin family. They are flightless birds, but excellent swimmers and tremendous in size, with white breast, short wings, black head, and long peaked bills. They stand fully 9 feet high. They looked at us with little surprise and presently waddled rather than walked toward the water and swam away in a northerly direction. The events that occurred during the following 100 or more days beggar description. We were on an open and iceless sea. The month we reckoned to be November or December. We knew the so called South Pole was turned toward the sun. Therefore, when passing out and away, the internal electrical light of the Smoky god and its genial warmth, we would be met by the light and warmth of the sun, shining in through the opening of the earth. We were not mistaken. There were times when our little craft, driven by wind that was continuous and persistent, shot through the waters like an arrow. Indeed, had we encountered a hidden rock or obstacle, our little vessel would have been crushed into kindling wood. At last, we were conscious that the atmosphere was growing decidedly colder, and a few days later, icebergs were sighted far to the left. My father argued, and correctly, that the winds which filled our sails came from the warm climate within. The time of the year was certainly more auspicious for us to make our dash for the outside world and attempt to scud our fishing sloop through the open channels of the frozen zone which surrounds the polar regions. We were soon amid the ice packs, and how our little craft got through the narrow channels and escaped being crushed, I know not. The compass behaved in the same drunken and unreliable fashion in passing over the southern curve or edge of the Earth's shell, as it had done in our inbound trip at the northern entrance. It gyrated, dipped, and seemed like a thing possessed. One day, as I was lazily looking over the sloop's side into the clear waters, my father shouted, "Breakers ahead!" Looking up, I saw through a lifting mist a white object that towered several hundred feet high, completely shutting off our advance. We lowered the sail immediately, and none too soon. In a moment, we found ourselves wedged between two monstrous icebergs. Each was crowding and grinding against its fellow mountain of ice. They were like two gods of war contending for supremacy. We were greatly alarmed. Indeed, we were between the lines of a battle royally. The sonorous thunder of the grinding ice was like the continued volleys of artillery. Blocks of ice larger than a house were frequently lifted up 100 feet by the mighty force of lateral pressure. They would shudder and rock to and fro for a few seconds, then come crashing down with a deafening roar and disappear in the foaming waters. Thus, for more than 2 hours, the contest of the icy giants continued. It seemed as if the end had come. The ice pressure was terrific, and while we were not caught in the dangerous part of the jam, we were safe for the time being. Yet the heaving and rending of tons of ice as it fell, splashing here and there into the watery depths, filled us with shaking fear. Finally, to our great joy, the grinding of the ice ceased, and within a few hours the great mass slowly divided, and as if an act of providence had been performed, right before us lay an open channel. Should we venture with our little craft into this opening? If the pressure came on again, our little sloop, as well as ourselves, would be crushed into nothingness. We decided to take the chance and accordingly hoisted our sail to a favoring breeze and soon started out like a racehorse, running the gauntlet of this unknown narrow channel of open water. Among the ice packs. For the next 45 days, our time was employed in dodging icebergs and hunting channels. Indeed, had we not been favored with a strong south wind and a small boat, I doubt if this story could have ever been given to the world. At last, there came a morning when my father said, "My son, I think we are about to see home. We are almost there. We're almost through the ice. See, the open water lies before us." However, there were a few icebergs that had floated far northward into the open water still ahead of us on either side, stretching away for many miles. Directly in front of us and by the compass which had now righted itself due north, there was an open sea. What a wonderful story we have to tell the people of Stockholm, continued my father, while a look of pardonable elation lighted up his honest face. And think of the gold nuggets stowed away in the hold. I spoke kind words of praise to my father, not alone for this fortitude and endurance, but also for his courageous daring as a discoverer and for having made the voyage that now promised a successful end. I was grateful, too, that he had gathered the wealth of gold we were carrying home. While congratulating ourselves on the goodly supply of provisions and water we still had on hand and on the dangers we had escaped, we were startled by hearing a most terrific explosion caused by the tearing apart of huge mountain of ice. It was a deafening roar, like the firing of 1,000 cannons. We were sailing at the time with great speed and happened to be near a monstrous iceberg, which to all appearances was as immovable as a rock-bound island. It seemed, however, that the iceberg had split and was breaking apart, whereupon the balance of the monster along which we were sailing was destroyed, and it began dipping from us. My father quickly anticipated the danger before I realized its awful possibilities. The iceberg extended down into the water many hundreds of feet, and as it tipped over, the portion coming up out of the water caught our fishing craft like a lever on a fulcrum and threw it into the air as if it had been a football. Our boat fell back on the iceberg that by this time had changed the side next to us for the top. My father was still in the boat, having become entangled in the rigging, while I was thrown some 20 feet away. I quickly scrambled to my feet and shouted to my father, who answered, "All is well." Just then, a realization drawn upon me, horror upon horror. My blood froze in my veins. The iceberg was still in motion, and its great weight and force in toppling over would cause it to submerge temporarily. I fully realized what a sucking maelstrom it would produce amid the worlds of water on every side. They would rush into the depression in all their fury like white-fanged wolves eager for human prey. In this supreme moment of mental anguish, I remember glancing at our boat, which was lying on its side, and wondering if it could possibly right itself, and if my father could escape. Was this the end of our struggles and adventure? Was this death? All these questions flashed through my mind in a fraction of a second, and a moment later I was engaged in a life and death struggle. The ponderous monolith of ice sank below the surface, and the frigid waters gurgled around me in frenzied anger. I was in a saucer, with the waters pouring in on every side. A moment more, and I lost consciousness. When I partially recovered my senses and roused from the swoon of a half-drowned man, I found myself wet, stiff, and almost frozen, lying on the iceberg. But there was no sign of my father or our little fishing sloop. The monster berg had recovered itself, and with its new balance lifted its head perhaps 50 feet above the waves. The top of this island of ice was a plateau, perhaps half an acre in extent. I loved my father well and was grief stricken at the awfulness of his death. I railed at fate that I too had not been permitted to sleep with him in the depths of the ocean. Finally, I climbed to my feet and looked about me. The purple domed sky above, the shoreless green ocean beneath, and only an occasional iceberg discernible. My heart sank in hopeless despair. I cautiously picked my way across the berg toward the other side, hoping that our fishing craft had righted itself. Dared I think it possible that may my father still lived? It was but a ray of hope that flamed up in my heart, but the anticipation warmed my blood in my veins and started it rushing like some rare stimulant through every fiber of my body. I crept close to the precipitous side of the iceberg and peered far down, hoping still, hoping. Then I made a circle of the berg, scanning every foot of the way, and thus I kept going around and around. One part of my brain was certainly becoming maniacal, while the other part, I believe, and due to this day, was perfectly rational. I was conscious of having made the circuit a dozen times, and while one part of my intelligence knew in all reason, there was not a vestige of hope, yet some strange, fascinating aberration bewitched and compelled me still to beguile myself with expectation. The other part of my brain seemed to tell me that while there was no possibility of my father being alive, yet if I quit making the circuitous pilgrimage, if I paused for a single moment, it would be acknowledgement of defeat. And should I do this, I felt that I should go mad. Thus, hour after hour, I walked around and around, afraid to stop and rest, yet physically powerless to continue much longer. Oh, horror of horrors, to be cast away in this wide expanse of waters without food or drink, and only a treacherous iceberg for an abiding place. My heart sank within me, and all semblance of hope was fading into black despair. Then the hand of the deliverer was extended, and the death-like stillness of a solitude rapidly becoming unbearable was suddenly broken by the firing of a single gun. I looked up in startled amazement when I saw less than a half-mile away a whaling vessel bearing down toward me with her sail full set. Evidently, my continued activity on iceberg had attracted their attention. On drawing near, they put out a boat, and descending cautiously to the water's edge, I was rescued, and a little later lifted on board the whaling ship. I found it was a Scotch whaler, the Arlington. She had cleared from Dundee in September and started immediately for the Antarctic in search of whales. The captain, Angus McPherson, seemed kindly disposed, but in matters of discipline, as I soon learned, possessed an iron will. When I attempted to tell him that I had come from the inside of the earth, the captain and mate looked at each other, shook their heads, and insisted on my being put in a bunk under strict surveillance of the ship's physician. It was very I was very weak for want of food, and had not slept for many hours. However, after a few days' rest, I got up one morning and dressed myself without asking permission of the physician or anyone else, and told them that I was as sane as anyone. The captain sent for me and again questioned me concerning where I had come from and how I had come to be alone on an iceberg in the far off Antarctic Ocean. I replied that I had just come from inside the earth and proceeded to tell him how my father and myself had gone in by way of Spitzbergen and come out by way of the South Pole country, whereupon I was put in irons. I afterward heard the captain tell the mate that I was as crazy as a March hare, and that I must remain in confinement until I was rational enough to give a truthful account of myself. Finally, after much pleading and many promises, I was released from irons, and then and there decided to invent some story that would satisfy the captain and never again refer to my trip to the land of the Smoky God, at least until I was safe among friends. Within a fortnight, I was permitted to go about and take my place as one of the seamen. A little later, the captain asked me for an explanation. I told him that my experience had been so horrible that I was fearful of my memory, and begged him to permit me to leave the question unanswered until some time in the future. I think you are recovering considerably, he said, but you are not sane yet by a good deal. Permit me to do such work as you may assign. I replied, and if it does not compensate you sufficiently, I will pay you immediately after I reach Stockholm, to the last penny. Thus the matter rested. On finally reaching Stockholm, I had already related, I found that my good mother had gone to her reward more than a year before. I have also told how later the treachery of a relative landed me in a madhouse where I remained for 28 years, seemingly unending years, and still later, after my release, how I returned to the life of a fisherman, following it sedulously for 27 years, then how I came to America, and finally to Los Angeles, California. But all this can be of little interest to the reader. Indeed, it seems to me the climax of my wonderful travels and strange adventures was reached when the Scotch sailing vessel took me from an iceberg on the Antarctic Ocean. The conclusion. Okay, I'm going to read the conclusion. Let's see what you all are doing. Who's still hanging out with me? Hello, everyone. Okay, I'm going to read the conclusion. You guys still hanging out? Let's hang out. The conclusion. Okay, let's see. Where are the slides now? All right, the conclusion. In concluding this history of my adventures, I wish to state that I firmly believe science is yet in its infancy concerning the cosmology of the earth. There is so much that is unaccounted for by the world's accepted knowledge of today, and will remain so until the land of the Smoky God is known and recognized by our geographers. It is the land from whence came the great logs of cedar that have been founded by explorers in open waters far over the northern edge of the earth's crust, and also the bodies of mammoths whose bones are found in vast beds on the Siberian coast. Northern explorers have done much. Sir John Franklin, De Haven, Grinnell, Sir John Murray, Kane, Melville, Hall, Nansen, Schwatka, Greeley, Pearly, Ross, Gerlache, Bernacchi, Andre, Amsden, Amundsen, and others have all been striving to storm the frozen citadel of mystery. I firmly believe that Andre and two brave companions, Strindberg and Frankel, who sailed away in the balloon Orion from the northwest coast of Spitzbergen on that Sunday afternoon of July 11th, 1897, are now in the within world and doubtless are being entertained as my father and myself were entertained by the kind-hearted giant race inhabiting the inter-Atlantic continent. Having in my humble way devoted years to these problems, I am well acquainted with the accepted definitions of gravity, as well as the cause of the magnetic needle's attraction. And I am prepared to say that it is my firm belief that the magnetic needle is influenced solely by electric currents, which completely envelop the earth like a garment, and that these electric currents in an endless circuit pass out of the southern end of the earth's cylindrical opening, diffusing and spreading themselves over all the outside surface and rushing madly on in their course toward the North Pole. And while these currents seemingly dash off into space at the Earth's curve or edge, yet they drop again to the inside surface and continue their way southward along the inside of the Earth's crust toward the opening of the so-called South Pole. As to gravity, no one knows what it is, because it has not been determined whether it is atmospheric pressure that causes the apple to fall, or whether 150 miles below the surface of the earth, supposedly one halfway through the earth's crust, there exists some powerful lodestone attraction that draws it. Therefore, whether the apple, when it leaves the limb of the tree, is drawn or impelled downward to the nearest point of resistance is unknown to the students of physics. Sir James Ross claimed to have discovered the magnetic pole at about 74 degrees latitude. This is wrong. The magnetic pole is exactly one half the distance through the Earth's crust. Thus, if the Earth's crust is 300 miles in thickness, which is the distance I estimate it to be, then the magnetic pole is undoubtedly 150 miles below the surface of the Earth. It matters not where the test is made. And at this particular point, 150 miles below the surface, gravity ceases, becomes neutralized. And when we pass beyond that point on toward the inside surface of the Earth, a reverse attraction geometrically increases in power until the other 150 miles of distance is traversed, which would bring us out on the inside of the Earth. Thus, if a hole were bored down through the Earth's crust at London, Paris, New York, Chicago, or Los Angeles, a distance of 300 miles, it would connect the two surfaces, while the inertia and momentum of a weight dropped in from the outside surface would carry it far past the magnetic center. Yet, before reaching the inside surface of the Earth, it would gradually diminish in speed after passing the halfway point, finally pause, and immediately fall back toward the outside surface and continue thus to oscillate like the swinging of a pendulum with the power removed until it would finally rest at the magnetic center, or at that particular point, exactly one half the distance between the outside surface and the inside surface of the Earth. The gyration of the Earth in its daily act of whirling around in its spiral rotation at a rate greater than 1,000 miles every hour, or about 17 miles per second, makes of it a vast electro generating body, a huge machine, a mighty prototype of the punny man-made dynamo, which at best is but a feeble imitation of nature's original. The valleys of this inner Atlantis continent, bordering the upper waters of the farthest north, are in season covered with the most magnificent and luxuriant flowers. Not hundreds and thousands, but millions of acres from which the pollen or blossoms are carried far away in almost every direction by the Earth's spiral gyrations and the agitation of the wind resulting therefrom. And it is these blossoms or pollen from the vast floral meadows within that produce the colored snows of the Arctic regions that have so mystified the northern explorers. Beyond question, this new land within is the home, the cradle of the human race. And viewed from the standpoint of the discoveries made by us, must of necessity have a most important bearing on all physical, paleontological, archaeological, philological, and mythological theories of antiquity. The same idea of going back to the land of mystery, to the very beginning, to the origin of man, is found in Egyptian traditions of the earlier terrestrial regions of the gods, heroes, and men, from the historical fragments of Manetho, fully verified by the historical records taken from the more recent excavations of Pompeii, as well as traditions of the North American Indians. It is now 1 hour past midnight. The new year of 1908 is here, and this is the third day thereof. And having at last finished the record of my strange travels and adventures, I wish given to the world, I am ready and even longing for the restful peace which I am sure will follow life's trials and vicissitudes. I am old in years and ripe both with adventures and sorrows, yet rich with the few friends I have cemented to me in my struggles to lead a just and upright life. Like a story that is well nigh told, my life is ebbing away. The presentiment is strong within me that I shall not live to see the rising of another sun. Thus do I conclude my message. Olaf Jansen. Okay, that is the end. Who hung around for the end of the story? That was 2 hours and 40 minutes. Whoa. Okay, thank you for joining. Who's here? And did we have trolls? Because I wasn't looking at the chatmosphere. I was just trying to get through the story. Let's see. Who's here? Who is here? Let's talk. Talk to me. I'm here. Etel. Okay, what do you have to say? Hard as steel and still getting hard. Hey, Etel, let me ask you. Um, what do you all think of this like this account? Because I heard it read, and like I told our brother John, who I do a podcast on Mondays with, I told John that this is a fascinating account, okay? Me. Hello. T. Whitten, you're here hanging out. Lori, you're here. Look at that. We're still here hanging out. Brian, look at you. Gilbreth, I just got started. Hi. Hello, Southern Branded Productions. You're still hanging. You guys are like night owls with me. Paul Lawson, you're here. Really, Leanne? No trolls entered the chatmosphere? Ernestina, we didn't have any trolls. I'm so glad, because I didn't want you all to be distracted by the trolls. What a story, right? Blurry Face 86. Okay. Okay, Eliana, you said I missed most of it, but I will definitely rewatch now. Fascinating story. I thought it was too. Kev, what are you saying, Kev? Let's see. This account sounds more real than the Admiral Byrd Journal. Okay, this is the kind of feedback I want to hear. Now, I want to just say this to the believers of Jah. I just wanted to read this as a story, just as if we were doing, oh, I'm reading you a nighttime story, okay? Just a historical account, only that we are very interested in history, and also a lot of us are fascinated with things like what Kev is saying, Admiral Byrd's discovery, his adventure into Antarctica and the mystery surrounding Antarctica, right? So I wanted to read this so that I can get an understanding. As I said earlier, I want to be aware of these accounts, okay? Because it helps. I think it helps. You thought it was a great story. Hey, Jola, I hadn't seen you in a minute. I want to piece together some things that are mythology, of course, because all of this informs us of some of these mythology, you know, mythologies of the different cultures. And some of these accounts can be taken into account, okay, in terms of even some of the cosmology. What did you all think of the cosmology of how the Earth was described? Do you think that they were describing a flat surface, or, as John said earlier, it's kind of like an ant farm? So NASA has thrown off my cosmology, and I have to remind myself that NASA is, has given me sort of, you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know up or down with NASA, but I believe in the biblical account of cosmology. Now, let's see what you're saying. Blurry Face, you said a lot of his account makes logical sense. So it does to you, really? Nancy, you thought it was a great story? Let's see. Southern Branded Productions, you say, I haven't read to since I was 8. Oh, you haven't been read to since you were 8 years old. Thank you. Oh, I'm glad. I wanted to give it some life and stuff, So I read it so you don't have to read it, okay? So I'm going to leave the PDF so that if you want to read it, I want to talk about this more. And the reason why I want to talk about it, because you already know I found some crazy things about the man who wrote the book of the account, okay? So this would be Willis. What you talking about, Willis? It's something about Willis that I will cover at a later date, because I don't want to keep this live stream so long. But I found something interesting with the author of this book. Now, this book, being so old, is in the public domain. So there are no copyright restrictions to it, and you can do with it what you want. So I will share that link. But I do want to hear more of your theories about what is the deal here. What are your theories? I want to hear your theories, and I want to talk more about these kind of things in the coming days because I want to do more research into the Arctic Circle. I don't know how it will unfold, but after I did the content on Scotland, I was very intrigued with Norway. And when you think about sailing vessels, even if you go on cruise ships, Norwegians are excellent at sailing. And they have a lot of interesting accounts, right? So I will share more of, like I said, I will share more about this author because I want to hear more from you. Okay. So let's see what else is being said here. Hey there, Zakiria Chine myth of White Snake's journey to Antarctica for elixir of immortality worth analyzing. Oh, yeah? Thank you. I do not want to mispronounce your name. I'm sorry if I didn't get it right, but thank you for joining. Where are you joining from, Zechariah? Oh, it says Zechariah. Oh, okay. So that's, let us know where you're tuning in from because your name, it makes me think that you're somewhere. Are you up in that area? Like, tell me. Lori, you say I'm going to check it for out on Kindle. May be there. Oh, yeah, check it out on Kindle. And I'm going to leave the PDF link for you, okay? So let's see. What else is going on? What else? What else? Let me know. I know a few of you probably have dropped off, but oh, you're from Turkey. Oh, welcome. Thank you for joining from Turkey. Oh, that's fabulous. Let's welcome Zechariah from Turkey, everybody. Let's welcome. And Southern Branded, you're a new name. Welcome to our chatmosphere. Thank you, T. Witten. So I'm not by myself on that. Okay, you and T. Witten, you're going to learn is fabulous. T. Witten knows a lot. I love you, T. Witten. Thanks for joining and hanging out with this late night reading, okay? Let's see, Nancy, what are you saying? It makes you think about why there is such mystery surrounding the Antarctica. I agree. So much mystery. All right. This is my fourth time watching. You love it, and thank you for all your work. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much. I appreciate your kind words. Paul, I just stepped out to look at the blood moon. Oh, there's a blood moon, Paul? Oh, I've been out of the loop. I didn't know it. Well, let's see, what time is it? It's almost 1 a.m. on the East Coast here in the North Americas. But I will probably sign off now as I wanted this to be a true reading of a book, okay? And we will chat more. And I think the only thing left I didn't read was the author's afterword. Do you want me to read that real quick? Let me read it because you know what? I might as well. I've read everything else. Hang on, everybody. It's one more page. It's a half a page, okay? It's the author's afterword. Let's see what the author, because I'm telling you, he's a person of interest, okay? You know how we talk about the 1800s? I call the 1800s a person of interest because they are very shady and something is very weird, okay, about the 1800s. So let me read what this author is just saying, okay? So hang out for a little bit more. What are you going to do? Go to sleep? You're not going to go to sleep. So listen to this one last thing and we're going to we'll meet up another time. Okay. I found much difficulty in deciphering and editing the manuscripts of Olaf Jansen. However, I have taken the liberty of reconstructing only a few expressions. And in doing this, I have in no way changed the spirit or meaning. Otherwise, the original text has neither been added to nor taken from. It is impossible for me to express my opinion as to the value or reliability of the wonderful statements made by Olaf Jansen. The description here given of the strange lands and people visited by him, locations of cities, the names and directions of rivers, and other information herein combined, conform in every way to the rough drawings given into my custody by this ancient Norseman, which drawings together with the manuscript, it is my intention at some later date to give to the Smithsonian Institute to preserve for the benefit of those interested in the mysteries of the farthest north, the frozen circle of silence. It is certain that there are many things in Vedic literature, in Josephus, the Odyssey, the Iliad, Terrian de Locopater, and early history of Chinese civilization, Flammarion's astronomical myths, Lenormand's beginnings of the history, Hesiod's Theogony, Sir John Maudeville's writings, and Sayce's records of the past that, to say the least, are strangely in harmony with the seemingly incredible text found in the yellow manuscript of the Old Norseman, Olaf Jansen, and now for the first time given to the world. The end. And with that, I will sign off. And I want to thank you for hanging out with me for this very unique reading. Maybe we'll do more of this, but we will get together and we will reason together as a collective and a community, and we will put more of these puzzle pieces together. Okay. Now I will see you all tomorrow. For you all that will join me and John for our podcast on Mondays, we do a, we fly by the seat of our pants. Okay. We're more like the George Norrie show. Okay. If you ever watched or listened to George Norrie. Okay. So we deal with all the tinfoils. Okay. Thank you so much, Leanne. I appreciate you all. And I will check you out later. Okay. So with that, God bless you.